Hello, Nelson here. So today I want to talk about history. Finally, I know a lot of you who've known me for the past few years know that I'm both a historian and a scientist. So this will be the first of many history discussions that I do for the channel. There are already some on Patreon. Even this topic here is something that I've talked about before on Patreon, but haven't yet talked about it in more public forums. So here we go. So, in the topic of history, I always start off with the premise that history is not written by who was right, but only by who remained. History is decided by the winner, not the truth speakers. And that's a very important paradigm to start with whenever the discussion of history takes place, is that because if you don't understand that winners write history, you're doomed to believe the narrative of the winner, which means you're not going to understand truth. You're never going to find truth if you only believe the winners or the largely accepted truth, right? Because for the most part, history has been a tool of political propaganda, socioeconomic control. It's been used for intentional awakening and enlightenment. Has been used for enlightenment as well as for oppression and suppression. So history has always been a tool, and the one who wins the fight is the one who controls the narrative. And that's the very streamlined premise of what history just is. So when you approach history from that standpoint, you then get to take everything at a different angle. You're no longer, let's just say, defending the wider belief thing. You're now, if your pursuit is truth, you're not looking for what most people believe necessarily. But that also doesn't believe that winners are always liars, or that losers are always liars, or losers are always telling the truth, or the less popular thing is always the true thing, and whatever the masses believe is what the deception is. It's a lot more convoluted than that, and it's lazy to subscribe to any one of those beliefs on its own. You have to approach every area of history, every area of understanding, learning, development, as it is, without a preconceived notion or a bias. And if you do have a bias, be honest about what your bias is so that you can recognize what it is. And I'll talk about some of my personal biases once we get to a certain part of what I want to talk about today. But I believe that's just a general premise, especially when dealing with history, is to understand that it is socioeconomic political propaganda in itself, especially what is the largely released format of what history is. What we learn in schools in America, I did grow up in America, so I'm speaking from that standpoint. If you're from somewhere else, I want to hear if your country or wherever you are, your county, suffers from the same issue. So I can only really talk about America. But yeah, so understand that, and then you get to actually embrace what the truth actually is. So what I want to talk about, well, I guess a good example of this, there's a video that I love. Someone did, if I can find it, I'll put it in the description or I'll put it in the comment section. But a man did a video called why do white conservative Christians vote Republican, and why do black Christians vote Democrat? And it was a really great analysis just on the perspectives from two different factions, truthfully. And he didn't conclude that one was right or wrong. It just gave a better perspective as to how the differences in what a person experiences in the same region at the same time can change what they're comfortable with accepting. In the sense that conservatism on its own, just as a baseline definition, means that you're trying to preserve the time period that you're in, or return back to a time period that was. Progressive implies that you're not happy where you are right now, therefore there must be a need for improvement. So even black conservatives are progressive in that, well, what the guy concluded in the video is that what they were experiencing, what white people were experiencing at the same time, was very different from what black people were experiencing. And truly, it was a lack of empathy or compassion till this day that leads to people voting the way that they do. That's neither here nor there. But he talked about how when white people, white conservative evangelical Christians, when they think of the good old days, they think of a time where their kids prayed in school, where everyone went to church on Sunday, where there wasn't any homosexual propaganda or presentation in the media, where where cultures were different, there wasn't so much diversity. So that's a general idea. It's very general, very low, but that's a general idea of what the good old days are to white people. At the same time, that same time period that white people tend to want to conserve, black people were getting sprayed with fire hoses and were getting their churches bombed and were having police dogs released on them because they wanted to vote. So even though they were both Christian, supposedly following the same God, believing the same Bible, reading and studying that same Bible, praying to the same God, they voted different because their embrace of life was different. The experience that they were having was completely different, and it did have everything to do with their race. At the same time, white people were enjoying life. Black people were experiencing the worst parts of it in this country. And that's just a general presentation of how history is different depending on who you ask. And if you try to take a side, you actually lose what the truth is, because both of them are right. White people aren't lying just because they say that they enjoyed the time period of the past. Black people also aren't lying when we say that America has always been cruel to us. There are truths, even though they're opposing, simply because it's coming from different parties within that same region. And that has to be taken into consideration. So, so what we end up with is one group saying that's how you end up with one group voting Republican and the other group voting Democrat, is because of what the different parties are more so leaning to in their presentation. I don't believe that either party of the United States is actually trying to help anybody, just to get that out the way. Something I've heard Apostle Vincent say before is right wing, left wing, same bird. So no, I'm neither Democrat nor Republican. I'm just a historian. So understand biases. So what I mean by biases, as I mentioned before, I'm Black in America, so I have a certain bias when it comes to history, in the sense that I understand it from the position of one of the more oppressed groups within this country. Therefore, I have a lot more empathy towards other people like myself who had the exact same struggles as I still have today within America. Now, that doesn't mean that this country hasn't grown at all. It's just that a lot of the things that were issues in the 50s, 60s, and 70s are still issues today. So certain things haven't gone anywhere. The presentation has only changed. But the understanding, like I mentioned, between why whites vote Republican and why blacks vote Democrat is the exact same perspective reasoning that is the reason why Donald Trump's Make America Great Again was such a controversial statement. Because for white people, they could think about a time when America was great to them. Now, for everyone that's not white, we understand that this country's never been great to any of us. Our greatest moments were times where we got closer and closer to equality and equity, and we still haven't reached that today. Um, we still are experiencing differing jail sentences for Black people. Mass incarceration is still a thing. This country has the most inmates out of anyone in the world, and most of them are Black, and that's not because we commit the most crimes. That even goes back into the history of how the police came into being. They were originally slave catchers. Now, understand this: when the United States abolished slavery with the 13th Amendment, slavery didn't get abolished. It got reinstated. Slavery didn't become illegal until 2022, just recently in our midterm elections when different states voted to make slavery illegal. That just happened this past election, this past midterm election, because the 13th Amendment says that slavery is illegal unless that person is a criminal. So how did America keep their slaves? They locked them up. So thank you to Ronald Reagan, who introduced the 3 strikes, the war on drugs, which wasn't a war on drugs. It was a war on drug users, which were Black, which was introduced to Black communities by the government, the same government that got Bobby Seale killed. I mean, not Bobby Seale, Fred Hampton, my bad. The same FBI that got Fred Hampton killed is the same FBI that introduced drugs into the community, which is the same time period that got Huey P. Newton hooked on drugs after his release, which led to the disbandment of the Black Panther Party, which was the fear of white conservative Christians at that time. And that even goes into the presentation of the winner, of how events of history unfold. It's a form of psychological warfare, the way that our history is portrayed. In schools, we're taught about Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks, right? We taught about them, we're spoon-fed them, and it's not that they didn't help. They were absolutely influential. I don't want to discredit their work or their efforts, but the issue is that the presentation is that all of the rights that we have today, all the freedoms that we now have, were obtained through peaceful protest only, as if Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks did it alone. She sat on the bus and got kicked off. Martin Luther King peacefully marched. And then the white people in power felt so much pity for Black people that they finally gave us our freedom to vote. And that just didn't happen. That's just not how history went through. And it's the simple fact that they focus on Martin Luther King, but they avoid Malcolm X. They focus on Rosa Parks, but they avoid talking about the Black Panther Party for who they were. And when they do talk about Malcolm X and the Black Panther Party, they don't actually share what they believe. They share their personal ideologies concerning those figures, because they don't want Black people to be inspired by those specific people. It's psychological warfare. They want us to idolize. They want us to see Martin Luther King only as an icon, because he did stand for pacifism. He had a non-violent approach. That is true. But Martin Luther King was a lot more radical than even they present him. When other groups were rioting at the same time and were tearing up cities, they asked Martin Luther King how he felt about it, and he said that riots are the language of the unheard. That doesn't sound like the Martin Luther King that we were presented in American history class. It was even embarrassing during 2020 when the riots were taking place after several innocent Black people got killed early that year, and the last one just so happened to be George Floyd. When the riots actually took place, Martin Luther King's son actually was on Twitter saying that his father would have approved. And funny enough, white people were in the comment section telling him, no, Martin Luther King stood for this and stood for that, to his son. Which goes to show that reading about someone is very different from knowing that person. If you caught it, you caught it. But That's the presentation of a person through our curriculums in school versus the reality of what a person stood for. Even though Martin's actual approach was nonviolent, he didn't discourage others from expressing their oppression the way that they saw fit. Malcolm X is usually presented, if presented at all, as being a bloodthirsty hunter for white people, and he never was. Malcolm X believed in self-defense, that if you're being beat up and possibly about to be killed by the KKK, by a racist police officer, fight back. And he believed in watching the communities to make sure that no funny business was going on. His mode was self-defense. He didn't believe in hunting. He believed in self-defense. But because they want to discourage us from actually taking on the mentality of Malcolm X, they don't want that manifestation. They don't want us to fight back at all. They don't teach us Malcolm X. And when they do, they teach him very little, and they teach him as if he was uninfluential. They teach us that we only got our voting rights because Martin Luther King marched, and not because there were several protesting and rioting groups that weren't as nonviolent. It actually took, in reality, it took the combined efforts of Martin Luther King. It took Malcolm X equally. It took the entire Black Panther Party, Huey P. Newton, Bobby Seale, Fred Hampton. It took the combined efforts, Angela Davis, of their works to finally get some of the liberties and freedoms and steps towards equality that we now have in America. The Black Panther Party suffers the same syndrome as Malcolm X in that they were the Black Panther Party for self-defense, but modern history paints them as cop hunters and killers and murderers, and that they were a group that was made to usurp authority over the government, and that was never true. Anyone who does research on the Black Panther Party and actually listens to them talk about what they believe and what they're trying to do, even eyewitness accounts understand that they were in direct opposition to the ideology that white people wanted for Black people at the time. They didn't want Black people to have any sense of pride about their culture. And the Black Panther Party was, just as Malcolm X was, about Black nationalism, in the sense that you should be proud to be Black in your nation. Simplified definition, but you shouldn't be ashamed to be Black. You shouldn't be ashamed to be what you just are. So the Black Panther Party was out there with their fro, showing off their natural hair texture, dressed in uniform. They were a cohesive unit. They worked together. And as we were taught in Christianity, a house divided against itself couldn't stand. So the FBI sent in a Judas, referencing the movie Judas and the Black Messiah, which I actually encourage more people to go see. Yeah, I recommend a lot of people see that movie because, at least in my opinion, it gives a very pure picture of what happened to Fred Hampton, what happened to the Black Panther Party in that area of the country, and how it was systematically and illegally taken down by the government. But that's not something that's taught in schools. That the FBI violated the rights, and actually they ended up winning a lawsuit. They had Fred Hampton killed, and he was only 21, if I believe. If I'm remembering right, Fred Hampton was only 21 when the FBI killed him. And he founded what was also called the Rainbow Coalition, which was a bunch of other groups who were fighting against the oppressive government of all different races, religions, creeds, so on and so forth, to get together and help the community. Most of what the Black Panthers did was community service. And they were met with oppression from our racist government in America. The free lunch program was started by the Black Panther Party, and the police officers showed up, knocked all the tables over, threw the food on the floor, and began to pee all over it. This is real history. They also arrested Fred Hampton. Later on, they broke into his house after having him drugged and shot him in his sleep. But that's history that's written. That's history that you don't really get from the winner, because the winner usually doesn't want to make themselves seem like the villain. So to avoid the shifting of the perception from the masses, they just don't talk about it. But great enough, they did win a lawsuit. The family of Fred Hampton did win a lawsuit for several $millions. But yeah, that's the presentation of history, because they want to pick your idols for you. And I don't mean idol as in like worship, but I just mean idol as in like icon, hero, inspiration. They pick your inspirations for you, and they paint your inspirations in a way that they want you to be like. So they don't show Martin Luther King's more radical side, that he actually was for other people, or at least not in opposition against people who did express their oppression more violently. He didn't have anything to say. Martin Luther King and Malcolm X met before, and they got along. Of course, they both went through their own evolutions as time began. It's a good chance that Malcolm and Martin at the very beginning of their runs wouldn't have gotten along with each other, but towards the end of both of their lives, they were killed a year apart from each other at the exact same age. They were both killed in their 30s. Yeah. But yeah, presentation of history goes a long way when it comes to our psychological level currently. A lot of us, because we are not critical thinkers, we're not actually taught to be critical thinkers in school. School is a failure today because it doesn't teach you to think. It teaches you to repeat and have a good memory. They don't actually want you to think outside of the box. They want you to think wider within the same box, but they don't actually want you to leave it. It's about the colonization of the mind, the mental plantation that a lot of us still live in. Systematic oppression through psychological warfare is what a lot of us are still under the effects of. Like very similarly, Apostle Vincent, who will be on the Inner soon, he was actually in Harlem around the time that Fred Hampton, around the time Fred Hampton was in his heyday and ended up getting killed. He was there when it happened, pretty much. So eyewitness accounts, or people who were in the area, people who were around that time, who were alive at that time that still remember, are often a lot more credible than many books that we'll read about historians that go back and look. I wonder, actually, and a lot of people my age feel the same way, I wonder what they're going to put in history books when they finally get to 2020. I wonder if they're going to mention that George Floyd was like the 20th black person that had got killed innocently that year. I wonder if they're going to include that, because if the reputation that this country has with portraying history truthfully continues, they're not going to say all of that. And we should stop expecting them to. We should get more comfortable with educating ourselves instead of looking for a system to spoon feed information to us so that we can cling wholeheartedly to that system. That is the number one way to get reoppressed and recontrolled, is to turn your brain off and accept someone else's. So as I come to my own conclusions, it doesn't matter how much I believe them. I still want everyone else that hears my content or hears other people's content to be critical thinkers. Think for yourself, come to your own conclusions, and believe that. If you go to college, still educate yourself, because they're taught a curriculum. Schools, especially grade school, is curriculum based. And it's very misleading. Very simply put, because America is ran by racist white people, those racist white people don't want you to know that they're racist and evil. So history is painted to make them all heroes and overlook or completely avoid the areas where they were cruel individuals. For example, Growing up in elementary, we heard the fact that George Washington had wooden dentures, which is an interesting fact. It's a true fact. He had wooden dentures. Just a cool, quirky, fun fact. What they left out is that the teeth in those dentures was taken from the slaves. Some of them would have their teeth pulled just to fill his dentures. Others were taken from the skulls of killed slaves that he would have off to take their teeth or other parts of their body, even put on display. Yeah, they leave that part out. So it paints the idea, oh, look how far technology's gone. Dentures used to be wooden, and they leave out the fact that they were filled with slave teeth. Christopher Columbus has a holiday in this country. That's freaking sad. What we're taught in school is that Christopher Columbus discovered America. And my generation, very specifically and very loudly, has been protesting against that since we were kids and saying, how can you discover somewhere where people were already living and thriving? But the lie gets even bigger when you realize that Christopher Columbus never stepped foot within what's today known as the United States of America. He physically never came here. His son did. And the atrocities that they committed on the Native Americans is sad and disheartening, with how much they raped and pillaged and raped and pillaged and raped and pillaged. And Christopher Columbus was actually one of the first child sex traffickers. He went there looking for Native American and African children, boys and girls alike, to sell to other Europeans so that they could have sex with them. That's history. History should be disheartening sometimes. It should be disturbing if you're studying real history. If all the facts that you're reading are fun facts, you're missing a broader picture. Christopher Columbus was considered a hero by the Europeans at that time, and even still today, because he still has a holiday in America. So he's still considered a hero, and he represents the spirit of America perfectly. Why is child sex trafficking? Why hasn't that come to an end? Because that's the spirit that America was birthed out of. It's the exploitation of other races for the benefit of white people. That's the spirit of America. America is the child of Britain. It's the child it's the child of Europe. Europe is that area of Europe is the child of Rome. It's that same spirit manifesting through different governments, through different time periods. And since this failed in the white utopia that was attempted, since America was a failure, too much freedom has already been given to people who aren't white. Currently, and you might not know this, but currently there's an attempt in South Africa where white people are trying to make a white-only community. That's happening right now as we speak. White people are trying to get their whites-only utopia. They've been trying for the last few hundred years. It hasn't worked. Now they're trying in South Africa. Just goes to show that if things aren't dealt with head on, they just try again later. If you avoid the truth because the truth is disturbing, you never fix the problem. The problem will just try again later. So what would I say the solution is? I'd say the solution is for us to get the racism out of ourselves. But being not racist isn't enough. Just saying, oh, I'm not racist isn't enough. You have to be anti-racist. To be anti-racist means that you're willing to call other racist people out on their nonsense. That's what'll help actually fix this country. And sadly enough, it's taken for my generation to get here to finally step up to some of our older family members who are racist. I love the stories of people who are willing to make Thanksgiving uncomfortable to tell off their racist family members. That's the type of stuff that we need. Because until things are confronted, they will continue to grow and fester. In Mississippi, no, not Mississippi, Missouri, following COVID lockdown, when children return back to school, it's a story that I just listened to yesterday. about about a black family and when their kids went back to school following COVID lockdown. Many of the students, pretty much all of the white students, came back protesting to bring slavery back. Yikes. Now, before COVID lockdown, that wasn't the case. So what happened in COVID lockdown that would change their minds to believe that slavery is something that should be brought back? They were left at home with their racist family members for a long period of time, so they got to teach them. And they got to indoctrinate. They got to impress their spirit. They got to impart their spirit to the youth. And all of this is usually at the expense of people of color. But those are modern day examples just to show that no, things aren't flowers, rainbows, and sunshine in the United States. In what was called the Gilded Age, referring to the time period where the oil and steel industries were starting to boom. I don't believe we ever left the Gilded Age. I believe we're still in a Gilded Age within America. Why was it called the Gilded Age? That's because it was gold to outsiders. It looked good from the outside, and then once you got in, you suffered. During that time, there was a time period of innovation. So money was moving. It just wasn't moving to who they thought it was going to move to. We had a lot of corruption as far as how business was able to be ran. We had a lot of corruption. I can't remember the name of the guy. That might be Marx. That might be Marx if I'm remembering right. But he talked about how the working conditions were so foul and were so inhumane that even in like meat processing units, people would fall into the vats and they wouldn't fish the bodies out. So a lot of the food at that time had a lot of people in it, to say the least. They were working nonstop. Henry Ford today is kind of made fun of because he's the one who invented the 40-hour work week. But at that time, that was a radical idea because people were used to working themselves to death. Henry Ford actually helped to put an end to the sweatshopness of the United States working system. But in truth, just talking about that whole Gilded Age, the president at the time, Roosevelt, this is something that people don't realize, is that time period, we had 3 Hitlers at the same time. We had Adolf Hitler in Germany with the Nazis, doing what he did to the Jews and attempting to conquer the world, which he would have. And then we had Roosevelt. Roosevelt was just as evil as Hitler, except he's American, so we make him a hero. What Hitler did to the well, not Jews, but the white people who were Jewish by religion in Germany was just as bad as what Roosevelt started doing to the Cubans and to the Cubans and the South and Central Americans. It was just as cruel. That was the same time, mind you, that America got its own concentration camps. We had Ellis Island and Angel Island. Guantanamo Bay is still active today in Cuba, which is our torturing unit. That is still an active concentration camp and torturing unit, where people are still, to this day, they spend 50 years in there without ever having a trial, just because they look suspicious. So it's just an outlet for more racist oppression for different groups of people. All of that stuff started with Roosevelt. Now, Hitler came and went, but the effects of Roosevelt are still in this country, yet we make him a hero. At the same time, we also had Joseph Stalin. Now, funny enough, Germany acknowledges that what Hitler did was bad. That's illegal. If you have any Nazi propaganda in Germany, you get in serious trouble for that. Meanwhile, in America, you can fly the Confederate flag. You can fly the Confederate flag. And you're just pretty much told, if you don't like it, grow tougher skin, grow thicker skin. Because America's not actually sorry. Germany actually is. America still wants their slaves, which is why we just voted against it in 2022. It's been legal. Like, there is still a prison in Louisiana, which I don't know how they're going to cope with the new law, but it is a active plantation from the time of slavery, which is one of the roughest prisons in the country. It's just the plantation that they send them to and have them work in the fields. Like, yeah, still active. So those are things to take into consideration when looking at the so-called American dream, the great country of America. You start to see why so many people of color didn't like Donald Trump. That's because the great America that he was saying that we should go back to, in fact, actually came from him getting mad at a black lady who was protesting in the middle of his one of his rallies, where he said, "You know, back in the good old days, we used to drag people out in the streets who would come and make noise like that. Yeah, we used to spray them with water hose. We would have let the dogs out on them." Now, other racist white people knew what he was talking about. At least the ones that were there. Eventually, the clip was cut short just so that you could hear, "Let's make America great again." But that's where that phrase had its origin at, was him talking about the return to the time where you could publicly abuse and misuse people with no repercussions. That's sad. Even sadder that he won the presidency and that Christians were convinced that he was a second coming of Moses, which that was embarrassing. But that's where different biases come in at. Interesting enough, a lot of the history that is portrayed as long ago is very recent. Like, recently, I was watching a video about serial killers getting sentenced, or mass murderers getting sentenced. And even in that video, the white serial killers got lesser sentences than the black ones. They gave one guy 700 years. He drove through like a parade and hit a bunch of people. And I don't actually think any of them died, or maybe one died, something like that. They gave him 700 years. America isn't 700 years old yet. That's outrageous. Like, sentencing for that only happens to black people. For the white serial killers in that same video, they gave them 100 years. They gave them 80 years, 60 years, 50 years. They gave him one guy, they gave 2 life sentences to. They're like, "Oh, well, that evens out." Well, no, because 2 life sentences is still a lot less than 700 years, because America's not 700 years old yet. America isn't even 300 years old. America's not even 300 years old yet. The whole issue of Jim Crow, many people think that black people are upset because of slavery. We're not. Most of us, slavery itself isn't what makes people mad about this country. It's Jim Crow and the era that followed. That is why a lot of people hate this country. That is where a lot of the tension between black people and white people come from. It's not slavery alone. It's the Jim Crow era and following eras. The lynchings, we still to this day haven't had a single year where someone didn't get lynched. There's still been at least one lynching every year. In 2020, before the death of George Floyd, there were already 13 lynchings. Black people found hanging from trees, and the police ruled all of them suicides. Just putting into perspective the country we live in. Even the way that the riots were perceived in comparison to riots that happened earlier those same years, January 6, 2021 and January 2020 both started with white people rioting. And they were perceived almost the same way, in the sense that there were actually 2 riots in 2020 by white people early that year. I believe one in January and one in February. Actually, no, it was, I want to say January. I'll leave that alone. It was early 2020. The first one was because I believe a baseball team lost, so they tore up the city. And the second one was because they wanted to have haircuts. They were protesting against the shutdowns. Donald Trump's response to white people tearing up the city was, they're good people. They're just a little upset. When black people were rioting, because we, even in the middle of a pandemic, we couldn't stop being killed, he called us thugs. And other races, white, conservative Christians, jumped on the bandwagon. That's just putting things into perspective. So I could go on about this topic for forever, so I'll leave it here. Remember, history is not usually written by the truth tellers. History is written by the one who has gained the most social, economic, and political authority in a time period or in a region. It's even the same with how Christianity formed today. What is now considered established doctrine was actually the losing side against the Gnostics in what would be considered early Christianity. What we believe now, well, what Christians believe now is more so the more favorable doctrine that persevered through the years, but it was also considered heresy by the large majority of people at the time for different reasons. There were, I believe, at least 10 different groups that were debating and arguing and fighting for which one of them would be the one doctrine. So if we look at the past, let's just say you are a Christian. Let's say I am a Christian, because I'm not. And I look back in history on Christianity, but I'm looking at everything through the lens of what we believe today is true. I'll consider every group in the past to be heretics. In reality, all of them were heretics. All of them were right. All of them were wrong on different things. But if I look at it from the lens of today of what we currently believe, I'll miss it all. I'll miss it all, which is why the whole inerrant stuff is a lie. It's deceptive. It's also psychological warfare. I don't want to talk too much about that because I'll make separate videos about that specific area of history. But if you want to hear a little bit of that, check out my video on the generations of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. The children of Japheth are masters of the soul. They're masters of psychological warfare. They're the ones that run the world right now. So the greatest thing that you can do is embrace your own culture. Come out of the systematic psychological oppression and embrace your identity in its fullness. Again, I encourage you, be critical thinkers, look into history for yourself. See what puzzle pieces you find, connect what connects, come to your own conclusions. Do not be spoon-fed by anyone. Y'all be blessed. There's more coming in the future. That's it for this one.